Alright, this is VEDN Day 3, and today I thought, hey, why not to give you a bookshelf tour, because I've seen people do DVD shelf tours in the past, and I've also seen several commenters are interested in what I have in my bookshelf. So, yeah, I'll just go through it right now. So, yeah, I got... this right here is the Diaries of John Quincy Adams, and the reason I got these is because looking into John Quincy Adams, I found him an interesting person just because of his life story, how he grew up in Europe. He was an American from the beginning of the nation's history as a country. But he lived most of his life in the royal courts of Europe, in Russia, in the Netherlands, in France, and he grew up speaking French, probably more than English. So I just find that interesting, and he was also a very intelligent, very precocious child, and a lot of these diaries, these early ones, you can see it starts at 1779. Can I get it to focus? Yeah. And he was only like, what, 10 years old at that time? He was actually he was roughly the same age as Napoleon. I think he was born 1 year before Napoleon. Yeah, and then they go all the way to the end of his life in 1848, and his father, John Adams, really told him to keep up with his diaries, and so we have this big collection. Watership Down by Richard Adams. This is, well, it's the Rabbit book. You probably have heard of it. That was a book I read in middle school. It took me a long time to read, but I eventually got through it, and it was like the greatest book I'd ever read. It was the greatest novel experience I've ever... now you might you might notice that I don't really have a lot of novels or fiction in this bookshelf, but I do have a few because they have a certain importance to me. And Watership Down is just this book that I just thought it was amazing, and I've only read it that one time because I don't really reread books. That's not really something I do. But, yeah, it's fantastic. I have a few books by Peter Ackroyd. I was interested in his stuff, although I haven't really read much of it. But I'm fascinated by England, so I've been collecting a bit of stuff from him. Here's a book on Roman Stoicism, and this will come in handy when I'm learning about Italy, because Stoicism was one of the biggest philosophies in ancient Rome, and it influenced a lot of the way the ancient Romans thought, and by extension the way people after them thought. Some stuff on Iran. These are both written by a guy named Michael Axworthy. I think his name is Michael. And I've read a little bit of this one, A History of Iran. I find Iran a fascinating country, even though I can never decide on how to pronounce it. Actually, whenever I hear that song by A Flock of Seagulls, and I ran so far away, I always just think of the country, Iran. But yeah, Iran is a place that really fascinates me. So I have a couple books about it here. This is a book, Lion and the Unicorn. You might remember the Lion and the Unicorn from Alice Through the Looking Glass. But the contemporaries of the author of that book were William Ewart Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli, who were the leaders of the Liberal and Conservative Party in the United Kingdom at the time. And they held the office of Prime Minister several times during their career, and they were kind of rivals who would go back and forth. And so this is a book about them and their relationship. I've read a little bit of it. I've always wanted to get more into this book, but haven't quite had the time for that. You'll notice that a lot of these books I haven't read, or I just haven't had the time to read just because I've been focusing on other books that are more pertinent to what I'm studying right now for my videos. Yeah, then here's a book on Latin. I think this is one of my grandmother's books. She died, and she had a whole bunch of books, and I took the ones that I was interested in, and so yeah, if I ever decide I need to learn a bit of Latin, here's a book that'll help for that. I also have a few books that my grandfather, who's still alive, her husband, we live with him, he got these like medieval times books because I guess he was writing a book, a novel about medieval times. I guess it took place in France because a lot of them are about France. And so he was getting rid of some stuff, and so I took all the, you know, medieval history ones. A Line in the Sand, this is a book that I've read, and this one is about how the thing is, like, in World War I, the British and the French were not actually really chummy with each other. They were allies, they were fighting against the same enemy, but they really didn't like each other. And especially when it comes to the Middle East, they had a lot of rivalry. And so a lot of the problems that are going on in the Middle East right now are because the British and the French, specifically the French, could not put aside their own prejudices. And if you read this book, you really end up hating the French because, you know, the British made some mistakes, but man, the French were just awful in the Middle East. I mean, they were just horrendous. There's a book about Martin Luther. Another medieval book from my grandfather. Pursuit of Glory. Yeah, this is part of the Penguin European History series, and it says the 5 revolutions that made modern Europe, 1648 to 1815. So I'm assuming 1648 is because that is not only the end of the 30 Years' War, but also coincidentally the year, or in the same ballpark of the years, maybe it was 46 or 47, when the English Civil War was happening, which resulted in the execution of King Charles, I think, in 49. But yeah, it's a book about revolutions. I haven't read this one yet, but I find this one interesting because I am fascinated by how this time period had a lot of revolutionary activity because of the Enlightenment. More feudalism stuff. Íslensk orðabók. This is a dictionary, means Icelandic dictionary, and this is a dictionary written in Icelandic for Icelandic speakers about Icelandic words, which was actually kind of hard to find. I was surprised by how hard to find this was, and this book is actually from the 80s, I think. It's an older edition, and because that was the only thing I could find. At least that wasn't outrageously expensive. But yeah, this, see, I study Icelandic. I've been studying Icelandic for about a little under 10 years now. And I've taken a break from it for a long time, but I still occasionally will do some work with it. And this book, I just wanted to have it for reference for, because, you know, sometimes, especially before ChatGPT was invented, like, man, ChatGPT, I wish I had that when I was a kid, because that is so helpful for language learning. But, you know, before that, you just had to have books like this. And English Icelandic dictionaries, Icelandic English dictionaries too. But I wanted to have one of these too, because I thought it could yield some information that you couldn't get out of just an English Icelandic English dictionary. Anyway, here's a book about Egyptian hieroglyphs. This is one I got when I was a kid, and this is not called Egyptian hieroglyphs, it's just called hieroglyphs. and that's because it also has a little bit of Mayan hieroglyphs at the end. And it's a book that, you know, tells you the basics of how they were read and written. But when I was a kid, when I was in 4th grade, I was very, very interested in stuff relating to Egyptian hieroglyphics, and I learned a lot about them, which I guess was the start of my interest in linguistics. And then here's a book about James Polk. I asked my dad to send me this one because I find Polk's presidency very interesting, even though he was a Democrat, and he kind of, as a Democrat back in the day, he had priorities and opinions that I don't really think were very wise. But what I really admire about him is that he was extremely effective, and he had 4 things that he wanted to do. He accomplished all 4 of them, and then he left. I mean, have you ever heard of that? Secrets of the Freemasons. This is a weird, wacky little book, kind of a pulpy book about the Freemasons. It's one of those that doesn't try to demystify them, which sometimes can be fun. Not a super engaging read, though. Here's a book about Spanish, because my mom was studying to be a social worker for a little while, but she quit because of, well, I don't want to misrepresent her reasons for quitting, but they are quite sensible. Given just the culture of social work, it's not very good. But anyway, she entertained the idea of learning Spanish, and so I did work with her a little bit on it, because I am kind of the language guy in the family. And so we bought this book together, but we didn't end up, because she ended up not pursuing social work, we ended up not pursuing Spanish. Here's a book about the English language, The Dark Valley. I think this is a book about the 1930s, which this author calls The Dark Valley. Here's a book called The Actuality of Communism, which is coincidentally next to this book about communism. These are all arranged in alphabetical order by author, so sometimes you get little coincidences like this. Brown and Bastiles. This is a rather dry book about, like, just the state of communism today. Yeah, and so here's the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and this is interesting because it has in its pages, you can see, actually you can't see, hold on, yeah, you can see here, there is Egyptian hieroglyphs, and then there's a transliteration of Egyptian hieroglyphs into Roman characters, an approximate transliteration, and then there's a translation into English. And so that was another one of those books that I got when I was really getting into Egyptian stuff. Hold on a second.
A few moments later.
So here's The Pinball Effect by James Burke. I've talked a little bit about that in a video I made about James Burke. Really cool guy, cool book. Here's the only book I think I have about historiography. Here's a book, I think this is about Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. I don't think I ever read it. Oh, it's about the scientists, yeah. So Napoleon's campaign in Egypt was actually kind of the birth of Egyptology. And so this is about the birth of Egyptology in Napoleon's campaign. I don't know where this book came from. There's a lot of books I just don't know where they came from. This is one of them. But hey, it's cool. It's a Cold War book about China. The Saga of the Vuls. This is a really cool edition. I have another book in this same series of editions. But this is a Völsunga Saga, which is the kind of the most famous saga. It's the one that Wagner based his Ring cycle of operas on. And even though Wagner's stuff is about Siegfried, and this is about Sigurdur, which is like the Icelandic version of Siegfried. It translates to the same thing. It's like something about victory. But he actually based more of his stuff, rather than on the Die Nibelungen, which is the German poem about Siegfried. He actually based the opera more on this, the Icelandic version. And another interesting thing is that this mentions Attila the Hun. Even though it's an Icelandic poem, apparently Attila the Hun, he's a character in this book. So, yeah, it's just a fascinating... If you're interested at all in Germanic studies, this is a really good one to get. War Commentaries of Caesar, this is one that my dad gave me recently. That will help in a future video, I think, because I want to make one about whether the Celts practiced human sacrifice, and Caesar did write a little bit about that. He wrote about the Wicker Man. Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is an overrated book. I don't like this book very much. I think it's kind of garbage, even though I love Joseph Campbell. It's funny, I love Joe Campbell, his films, his documentaries. I do not like this book, though, and so that'll be, maybe one day I will make a video talking about Joe Campbell. That should be interesting. Jesus from Outer Space. This is a book that my dad gave me. Richard Carrier is this dude who's like, believes that Jesus never existed. There was no historical Jesus. And actually there is an acquaintance of Richard Carrier named Cameron Riley, an Australian podcaster and filmmaker, who I really like. I think he's a really cool guy. And I think Cameron Riley and my dad would get along really well together. But he actually, my dad showed me Cameron Riley's Napoleon series, which was his podcast that really kind of got him started in the whole history podcasting genre with J. David Markham. But my dad showed me that when I was a kid because I was getting interested in Napoleon. And then when I was a little bit older, I checked out Cameron Riley's other podcasts, and I found that he was a really interesting person. And he made this documentary called Marketing the Messiah a few years ago. And where he talks about the history of really early Christianity and how Paul kind of changed Christianity. And Richard Carrier features in that documentary as one of the people he interviewed. And that documentary deals a little bit with Carrier's theories about the origin of the Christian myth. So I find that interesting that my dad showed me Cam's Napoleon series, and then many years later he shows me Richard Carrier. He probably doesn't even know that there was a connection between those two, but there is. Yeah, Albert Camus. I think I read like 1 or 2 pages in this book, and I thought it was extremely boring. I don't know how people read this kind of philosophy. Yeah, let's see. Anything else interesting over here? Cicero. That'll come in handy. This book, I've gotten a bit of information from it. It came in handy when writing my first entry in the Italy series that I'm doing, and so you'll see that next year. I took some research from this one. It's about the Bronze Age collapse. And this one, my friend Michael said this was a good book. I've never, I haven't read this one, but I'm interested in reading. It's about the Dark Ages. Here's another book about Egyptian hieroglyphs. This one's a little bit better than the other one that I showed you. And I ended up reading this one quite extensively. Let's go now over here. So I have more books bleeding in here, and then I also have some DVDs and stuff. I'll look at the DVDs a little bit later. This video is not going to be in one part. I'm going to do this over maybe a couple days or 3 days, I don't know. But yeah, let's ignore the DVDs for now. The DVDs are kind of here to fill up space in the bookshelf because it's an ever expanding library and I need more space, and so these are kind of like filler space. But yeah, we have a book about Esperanto. I think this is another one of my grandmother's books that she left behind. And right next to one of my grandpa's medieval books. But Esperanto is interesting because it's a constructed language. It's a real language. It's not a fake language, and there are people who speak it, and there are even, I think, a few native speakers of Esperanto. So it's a very legitimate language, but it was made up back in the 1800s by a guy named Dr. Zamenhof, I think. Interesting language because it is based on real life languages and Romance languages, but it was actually it was flirted with by a lot of people as a possible universal language. That was why it was invented. In the Conlang community, they called it an auxlang, auxiliary language. And even the Chinese government for a while, I believe, was publishing official documents in Esperanto as one of their languages. Vincent Cronin, Napoleon, this is, I've read this book all the way through. This is a very good biography of Napoleon. It's kind of old, but it's a very good one. This is actually the one that got Cameron Riley started with Napoleon, which of course eventually led to him doing that Napoleon podcast. 1453, this is by Roger Crowley, who also did this one, Conquerors, which I haven't read, but I've read this one. And this one is about the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans. Very good book, really well written. I love the way he tells the story, because it's basically a 6-month story of this 6-month-long siege of this city. And it's fascinating. Really fascinating. Here's a workbook on Italian grammar, because I'm learning Italian. Giant, fat book about the history of Wales. This is another one where I don't remember where this came from. Oh, you know what? I think this one came from, because in my area there's I think a library. Yeah, there's a library at the Reno Town Mall that does these book sales every few months, where they'll sell off all these books for like 50 cents a piece. And so a lot of these books I just got from these bookshelves, book sales. But yeah, I mean, I was able to collect a lot of books for super cheap doing that. I haven't done that in a long time. I might like to go back and see one of these days if I can find more stuff from that, because man, it's a great way to get cheap books. But yeah, this absolutely fat history of Wales. I didn't even know there was so much history of Wales that you could write a book this fat. This is a book of Old English grammar, and it also has a bit of a reader on it, which is good. You always want a reader for a grammar. But this is by a guy named Diamond. I don't remember his first name, but he actually was a local here, and I believe he taught at the university here, and he was, I think my grandfather might have known him, because he also taught at the university. But my friend Michael gave me this book, is the one that he had, and I'm really glad to have it, because I'm fascinated by Old English. I mean, Old English is very, very similar to Icelandic, and I'm interested in Icelandic, so I'm also interested in Old English. Here's a book about Hannibal Barca. I remember I bought this at Barnes & Noble a long time ago when I was a kid. I did read a little bit of it for my Italy video that I did, but I'm probably going to be reading a lot more of it for a future video on Italy, because I haven't gotten to the Punic Wars era yet. Monarchs of the Nile. This is a book all about the kings of Egypt. That's interesting. I mean, that's cool. A book just about the Egyptian kings. I mean, I think that's needed. I think we need a book like that. Like, there's a lot of books about ancient Egypt in general, but this is one just about the kings, which I like. A dark history. I have a few of these, a little bit gimmicky books that you find at Barnes & Noble, but I like them because you know why. If you open them up, they're very beautiful on the inside. They have lots of big pictures. They look very nice. It's a very pleasant way to learn history. But yeah, they're called A Dark History. So they focus on all the juicy stuff, you know, the stuff that you want to hear about.
A few moments later.
Here's an English-French dictionary, French-English dictionary. Book about fascism. This, I believe, is one that my dad sent me. I haven't read it yet, but it is a history book about fascism, so it will come in handy eventually. Here's one, The Third Revolution, and you can see Xi Jinping there. So that's interesting. I guess the first two revolutions, what were they? One of them was Mao. Was the second one Deng Xiaoping? Or maybe the first one was Sun Yat-sen, I don't know. But interesting idea for a book. I haven't read this one yet, but I would like to learn more about China. Stefan Einarsson, Icelandic Grammar, Text, and Glossary. This is another book from the 80s. Actually, it's written in the 40s, but it was this edition is from the 80s. You can see the spine is totally worn out. I totally wore this thing out because I read this thing from cover to cover in high school. And yeah, I just, like, this spine wasn't meant to be read as much as I read this book. It should have been in a hardcover, but paperback is the only one available for this book, I believe. But yeah, this is one of my favorite books. I really treasure this book. This is like one of the most important books in my life. Like, just looking at it and touching it makes me remember the days when I used to read this all the time. This is one that I've read all the way through. The Druids. Fascinating subject. I'm going to be reading this again if I do that video about the Celts practicing human sacrifice. Really fascinated by stuff relating to the Celts and Druids, just because it's in the historical era, but they didn't write any history themselves, and so all we have for history is stuff written by Greeks and Romans. And then later on in the Dark Ages, we see Ireland start to have a lot of literature written in Irish. And then we start seeing Welsh poetry as well, like Taliesin stuff. But that's in the Dark Ages, which is post-Roman. So it's after this classical period when the Druids were at their height. And so that it makes it into a mystery. And so a book like this is going to be about trying to unravel the mystery of the Druids. Then what's this? Oh, it's a book about Judaism. Okay. This one, Wage Labor and Guilds in Medieval Europe, rather. I bought this one recently because it's going to help me understand the whole guild system, which is something I need to understand for understanding corporatism, which I need to understand for understanding fascism. And so this will help me understand a bit of the heritage of the whole idea of the corporate system, which a guy who was a big supporter of the whole guild idea was this guy, Julius Evola. Revolt Against the Modern World. Fantastic title. And I love that it's rendered in like an Art Deco-ish kind of font, which is very modern, so there's a kind of irony there. But really beautiful edition. I mean, look at this. This is a really cool cover. Really cool title. But I have read a book by Evola before. Recently, actually, I read his book, Fascism Viewed from the Right, which I thought was great. I really loved that book. But that one is on Kindle, so I don't have it in my bookshelf. But I do have this one in my bookshelf. I haven't read this one. But this one is more of his thoughts on life removed from analyzing other people's philosophy. But yeah, super far-right reactionary, like total crankish, weirdo, crazy man, eccentric Julius Evola. You gotta love him. This book, I've read this one. I thought it was rather boring. Britain After Rome. This one is about the Bible, I believe. This Silk Road's New History of the World, I don't know what to expect from this one. But looks kind of interesting. I think I'll do one more shelf and then I'll call it a day for today and pick up the rest tomorrow. But here we have a book about the Middle East, another book about the Middle East. This one is called A Peace to End All Peace, How Clever, about the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. It's a book about the Enlightenment, I guess. Couple books about the Enlightenment by the same author. That's interesting. These must have been my dad. I'm guessing these are my dad gave these to me. Because my dad got rid of all of his books. Pax Romana, this is just about the whole Roman Empire system as they had it. The Bully Pulpit. About Theodore Roosevelt and I guess William Howard Taft. This is an era of history, of American history, that fascinates me because the 1912 election was an election where the three candidates, and there were three in this one, were all presidents. Well, one of them wasn't a president yet, Woodrow Wilson, but he became president because Roosevelt here spoiled the vote for the Republicans by running third party. And it's just fascinating because this is the progressive era of history. And you see how people are starting to embrace progressive politics like Roosevelt in a really, really important way. And all three of these candidates, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, all had a progressive agenda of their own. Here's a book about the Ottoman Empire. Here's a book, I haven't read this one, I probably never will, but it's a book like stories written in honor of J.R.R. Tolkien. So I guess stories written by various authors who are fans of Tolkien. Might be interesting, I don't know, I'm not much of a fiction guy. This one, what is this? This is this book about the New World. The title Marvelous Possessions got me to think because I remember I do have a book from archive.org that was actually written during this time period, during the 1500s about the New World, and it was Marvelous Possessions of the New World, so I wonder if that's where this title came from. From Plato to NATO. You gotta love when people put these clever little these clever rhymes in there. I think it's kind of silly, but Fascism by Roger Griffin. This is the first book on fascism I ever read. I don't think it's a very good book, honestly. I have problems with this. I think that Roger Griffin had this weird way of defining and understanding fascism that it doesn't really, I don't know, it doesn't really jive with me. He's the palingenetic ultranationalism guy, and I don't know, it's it feels like he was thinking about it way too hard, you know, I don't know. Secret Teachings of All Ages, this is a bizarre book. This was this dude's pet project, Manly P. Hall, back in the 1920s. And this book is... it's downright idiotic at times. It is weird. Very, very, how do you say it? There's a word that's on the tip of my tongue. It's very credulous, that's what it is. It's like this guy was fascinated by like esotericism, and he basically like believed everything that he read. And then he wrote this book about it, and it's huge and it's very long, but it's a little bit odd. I read about half of it. Vikings, this is another one of those kind of cool, it's not in the same series, but it's, you open it up and there's a lot of beautiful pictures. Speaking of beautiful pictures, this one, Edith Hamilton Mythology, decent book about mythology from a textual standpoint, but what's really cool about it is not the text, but the pictures. I'm going to open it up so that you can see some pictures and just look at the art in this book. I mean, this book is absolutely gorgeous with its illustrations, and they're all just these pen drawings, but they're reminiscent enough of the style of Greek pottery to feel classical, while also being its own thing. Here's another book by Hamilton, The Roman Way. I'll probably read this as I study the Romans. All right, I normally wouldn't do an editor's note for a video like this, but I felt bad that I didn't point out this very interesting fact about Edith Hamilton. So look at this picture. This is Edith Hamilton. Now, does she look a little bit familiar to you? Maybe she does? Well, here's a picture of her more famous sister, Margaret Hamilton. Now, does she look familiar to you? Is this ringing any bells? No? Well, how about this one? Yep. Edith Hamilton was the sister of the Wicked Witch of the West. That's an interesting little fact. This one, Herb the Vegetarian Dragon. I had this book as a kid, although this is not the copy that I had when I was a kid. I had a hardcover, but the hardcover I looked up, it was really expensive, so I bought this paperback instead. And this is a pretty interesting book, because I think this is the first book where I heard about vegetarianism. And I think it has a cool message. I like it. Here's a book, Teach Yourself Marx, book about Marxism as a good introduction to the subject, because yeah, Marxism is quite complicated and dull, really, and so you need a book like this to understand it. Leviathan by Hobbes is another one that I got from the book sales. This one I have read a tiny bit. I never really got past the metaphysics part of it, and I don't really like metaphysics at all. Yeah, interesting book. I've heard things about it. I've read the introduction, so I know a little bit about it, and just the way this is like the authoritarianism of its time, which was basically absolute monarchism. So kind of fascinating. Let me see. Oh, this one. Really good book. Ronald Hutton. Now, yesterday I made a video about like showing my mom different things, and you remember, if you saw that video, I talked about the BBC Farm series, where they would live on a historical farm for a year and learn all the techniques. Ronald Hutton was the guy they would bring in to talk about the folklore elements and the celebration and kind of seasonal festival stuff, because he is a folklore historian, and he is probably my favorite historian. I love Hutton. I love the way he approaches history. I think he has a great kind of love of the subject that really comes through when he talks, and really cool guy. My mom used to joke that he was the guy they brought in whenever they had a party. He would show up for the party. And he's kind of always been in my life because, like, even before I discovered that series, I saw it when I was learning about the Druids, which actually came from this book because the first chapter in Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall was about Druids. And I got interested in Druids. And I found this interesting phenomenon of the Neo-Druids, and Ronald Hutton is connected with those guys. And so in one of the Neo-Druid videos that I found by the OBOD, the Order of Bards, Obates, and Druids, he was a big part of that video. So that's cool. And that was back in like 2011 when I found him there. And he's just been showing up ever since then. And so I really like this book. It's a history of neo-paganism. It's a history of neo-paganism, which is a great thing to have because neo-paganism is actually probably a bigger deal than a lot of people realize. And it's a fascinating topic that requires its own history. Here's a couple of books about English history by a guy named Dan Jones. I haven't read either of these yet. This is a book that I'm probably never going to read, but I did have a guy in comments of one of my videos point that out, and he was like, oh, that's cool, you got that book. But I was like, yeah, I'm never going to read it. Book of War. This is a book I got from the library when I was a kid, and my dad ended up buying it for me. Just a book that has a lot of excerpts from old historical documents about wars. The Bible as history. There's a book about the invention of language. This book I've read, Caliphate, a book about the old the idea of the caliph and the caliphate, which is interesting. I didn't really know anything about it before I read it in this book, but it's the history of that idea as it was expressed before, during, and after the period of the historical caliphs. Dark history, another one of these ones. This one I've read quite a bit of, the Roman Emperors one. I love this book because it's you know the series I, Claudius, which was a book series too. You have that guy, the author of that book, was like, he later looked back on the book as like not one that he was very proud of because all he did was just take like the juiciest, scandalous elements of things that he read about Roman emperors and just put them all in the book with no discernment over which ones are true and false. That's kind of like what this book is. I really like this book because it's like, here's all the juicy details. The section on Tiberius and his palace at Capri is quite enlightening. Kierkegaard, this is one that I found in my grandfather's stuff. I guess he was getting rid of this one, so I took it. Don't know anything about Kierkegaard. Welsh grammar. I was getting interested in studying Welsh as well. As you can see, there's the Icelandic, but there's the Welsh. I put the Welsh on top because even though I'm not as interested in Welsh as Icelandic, it has a cooler flag. It has this dragon. And it's also part of the UK, which connects to me more, I think, than Iceland. But yeah, Welsh is a fascinating language. I really love Welsh. I love the way it looks. I love the way it sounds. I love everything about it. And also it has an interesting grammatical feature that may have influenced English, even though English is a Germanic language. English doesn't have a lot of active voice in the present tense. So you don't say, I sleep. You say, I am sleeping. That is not a feature that's very common in Germanic languages, but it is very common in Welsh. It's the thing that they do the most in Welsh. Although there is passive voice in Icelandic, and it's pretty common. but it's a different kind of construction. I think the Welsh one is a little bit closer to English. Maybe I'm wrong though. Actually, no, I think I am wrong about that. I think the Icelandic one might be closer to English. But it's just something I've heard about the Celtic legacy on English. That might be true, it might not be. Another book about Iran, a book about Babylon, but this one, The Douchebag Bible. This is the book by The Amazing Atheist. It's garbage, but oh my god, it's like a horrible excuse for a book. But hey, it's his book, and I'm a big fan of him, so I bought it. Even though I knew it was gonna be trash, I bought it, and yep, it's trash, but I like it. So, yeah, that's the first half of my bookshelf tour. I'm gonna do the second half tomorrow for VEDN Day 4. But this is VEDN Day 3. Signing off. See you tomorrow.